Long time ago, I was working on an article with a colleague of mine who's now in Liverpool, Dr. Paulette Singley, and we wrote an article called Entrancement. All we did was talk about where does interior really end in an urban setting. Does it really end at the facade of the building? We start talking about a whole host of resources, talking about what the facade really is, like when does the facade really end and where does the street begin.
Welcome to the Wonder Podcast. This is your host, CCB, with another interesting conversation to share with you all. I'm going to say, when we talked with Annie Chu about being on the podcast, the first thing that came to mind for me was the word polymath. And that is a person of wide-ranging knowledge or learning. And then I read something about polymaths that said, well, you would think with the access that everyone has to the internet and all that information, that the world would be filled with polymaths. But we're not. And there's something special about individuals that have wide-ranging knowledge and learning and that can make the connections to have positive energy and elucidation come from it. So I'm really excited to welcome Annie Chu to the Wonder Podcast. Annie, thanks for joining us.
Hey, CCB, thank you so much. And that's really high praise. I think it's the first time anyone used that word on me, and I tend to use that word on other people. So,
well, there you have it.
Humbled and honored. Yeah.
Well, so why don't you tell us, tell the audience, share with us how you came to be where you are today.
Okay. I was born and raised in Hong Kong. That explains the way I look, Chinese. And I came to the United States for my last 2 years of high school. And then I continued to pursue a college education with a pre-med focus. And then 3 years into that, I realized that, architecture is knocking on the door, and that's a different story for another time. But and it's also the reason why I went into teaching is it's really thanks to a teacher's prompt that I pursued architecture. And I went to SciArc and then married my classmate upon graduation, moved to New York sight unseen. And while he's pursuing his graduate work, I started working in the architecture industry with Todd Williams and Billy Tian. In the early phases of their career development. Went back to Columbia for my graduate work when my husband finished his, and we both worked for Todd and Billy for a while, and then came back to Los Angeles and started working for Frank Israel, the brilliant, late Frank Israel, who unfortunately passed away in his 50s, but, was a major force of what's going on in Los Angeles in the 1990s, post that recession, right? And then in 96, I started my own architectural firm. Somewhere in there, realizing that what I've been doing both in New York and Los Angeles have a lot to do with the focus on the interior, even though, within the big umbrella of architecture, both offices who are my roots, Todd Billy's and Frank's, pay a lot of attention to interiors. I remember Frank telling me basically, hey, never design a window from the outside, always design it first from the inside out, right? And we're always talking about space. So that sets the path on this kind of interior architecture journey. I've been teaching. As of 2 years ago, I stopped teaching, but 30 years of teaching in mostly architecture and design schools. And I realized that, what my emphasis have always been is the kind of crafting and the sculpting of that space and that experience of the interior, which is 98% of our life every day, right? And more so now than ever. So that's where I am. That's why I ended up being an architect and an interior designer and educator, for that area in specific.
So the amount of time, and back to your your polymath title, back the amount of time that you have put into constant learning and developing greater bodies of knowledge and sharing that, and that reciprocal relationship that you have in the profession of educating. I'd love you to spend a little bit of time, if you would, talking about what you think the future of design education might need to be. Where is it shifting?
Mm-hmm. And design changes so fast, and since I'm 2 years out of it, I'm feeling like a little bit less, legitimate to talk about that. But just based on my past experience and what I've been seeing, I think that there's a greater concern about the impact that we're making, as educators to the next generation. And I would feel like the kind of ethical struggle between a designer who is off the world or a designer who is kind of on the outside looking in. What I meant by that is, if you are kind of off the world, which is the only way that you can design, then everything that is the concern of the world should be the concern of your design career and your profession and your daily work. So that covers climate change, that covers all the concern about inclusivity, social justice, and even a deeper understanding of the human condition. Like, what does it mean really to live? And that really, I think in design education, I see a trend towards almost in all the architecture schools I was looking at, where maybe 10 years ago, I see a lot of form making, right? People building models and digital models, whatever, and they're just looking at the building like it's a piece of sculpture. Now more and more, I see an infiltration of design studio projects that really begin to pay greater attention to the spaces they're making. And I'm hoping this will continue, because I think ultimately, in my world, architecture is there to make an interior, and that's a very opinionated way of thinking about architecture, but that's how I think about it. It's about that shelter, it's about that habitation, it's about how we connect with the rest of the world. It's really that experience on the interior. The exterior is fleeting, and I think that even spaces in between exteriors, such as spaces in between buildings, I qualify that as an interior too. It's a space, So I'm hoping that the design education trend, the trajectory that's going on, which is a reflection of our dealing with the pandemic and the endemic, that we ended up being in interior spaces or making interior spaces out of exterior spaces, assigning those functions of the interior to the outdoor. All of that stuff puts, I think, interior design up in a kind of in the limelight, so to speak, right? Like, this is important. This cannot no longer be just something that you do after architecture. It's something you do at the beginning and with architecture.
Well, there's that the human-centric component that you're addressing. That should we not always be concerned about the user, and what that experience is of the place, of the space, as compared to, as you would say, the architecture as an artifact or a monument or a sculptural piece, which is a completely different way of looking at it, because that is in and of itself.
Right.
It can stand alone, but no building stands alone without people, except for maybe some of those large.
Also, to tack onto that too. I mean, that's the kind of amazing thing, and that's what keeps me in architecture as well, is that architecture does have all these different capabilities. It can symbolize, it can, present things that are kind of abstract. It makes a reality. It addresses people, but it also addresses a culture. It addresses the world. So there are all that. But I do think that you're right. The kind of human-centric, and this is a term that we started hearing about 15 years ago, right? And the human-centered design becomes a kind of a buzzword. But understanding what it means to be fully human, not just addressing all the senses, which, there's been since the 1930s, French philosophers and stuff have been talking about, phenomenology, which is actually not a very popular term to be spoken of in architecture schools for a very long time now. But understanding aspects of basically how we make space and what the space's impact are extends to architecture as well. Yeah.
You're an architect, you're an interior designer, you're an educator, you're a theorist. And I'm struck by your actual locations of habitation that, from Hong Kong to Los Angeles to New York to Los Angeles. So major urban areas.
Yeah.
And that's, they have to be about place. They're certainly about people in that place, but they have to be about place. So how do you feel, if at all, the places where you have spent time have had an impact on your perspective?
I think that's the interesting question. No one had sort of linked that, but in a way, I am a very urban person. That's how I was brought up. And I love cities because I think that they're so potent of memorable experiences, right? They're so full of personality and character, and it's always intriguing. So I think that, growing up in Hong Kong and seeing that very Blade Runner-esque, West and East mixture and the clashing of things, and that affects everything from the way that we speak in the Chinglish style, with English words mixed in between the Cantonese and all this stuff, to the way that the buildings are hybridized and the functions of spaces are hybridized. All of that stuff is like an amusement ride. Like you're always fully kind of on and being bombarded by these kind of contrasts. And then you go into, for example, Los Angeles, and I know Los Angeles from two different times. I knew Los Angeles from the late 70s through the 80s, early 80s, and then returning in the 90s. It's always, what I love about that aspect is that Los Angeles is poised to be that kind of space where nature is still present, but then, like Rainer Banham spoke on the four ecologies, we have the freeways, we have this whole car thing going on, we have the quilt of different cultures that spreads over all these, square miles of Los Angeles, but then we have the mountains and then we have the ocean, right? And that contrast between the negotiation between nature and this different cultures clashing and kind of moving constantly, negotiating space within Los Angeles and, dealing with cars and getting off of cars. And I mean, it's amazing and dazzling and always going to be this kind of frontier energy in Los Angeles that I enjoy. There's nothing better to kind of lift your spirits than, and I just recently posted a video that I was like sitting in the car. My husband was like driving up this 110 freeway towards downtown in the winter, about 4:30, and the golden light that we're famous for reflected on all those skyscrapers as dusk comes along, as dusk or dawn, I can't remember. Yeah, when the sun begins to set, it just like it lifts your spirits, like you can't help but with that light, and the color of the light lifts your spirit. And then New York is just, it's starting to feel like London to me a little bit. It feels like an old aunt that you always want to go visit. I spent like 6 years of like the really formative years, my roots, of my development of my career is in New York. And, I love that city so much. And I see bringing my daughter ever since she was young, every year to New York and seeing her light up also. And she's there now too. There's something about, just hearing all the foreign tongues being spoken everywhere you go, seeing the different colors, faces, and, and always constantly, there's a kind of push negotiating between what has been done and what's new. And New York, basically jockeying for still the position of leadership, right? Of cultural leadership in the world, while they struggle with their own, discrepancies and decrepit infrastructure and all that stuff. It's just wonderful to watch, and wonderful to be, but to visit. Yeah.
I was in Los Angeles over the New Year, and I had to run into an office on the 32nd floor downtown on 7th and Olive, and it has 360 views, and it was that one of those clear days where you can literally see forever, and you can see the mountains, and you get that like totally astonishing sense of I'm on the 32nd floor of a massive high rise, and I am just looking at snow on the mountains, and there's the ocean sitting out there, and I'm going to say the scale of height and lower and vista is this was a question I was going to ask you. For me, I am, as a native San Franciscan, I love proximity to the ocean, and I love the ability to see. So when I get so over energized in New York because there's so much going on, and I can't negotiate as easily my own sense of self and place. But when I see those kind of things, so I was wondering, with where you have lived and with the relationships that you've developed with those cities, is there one type of space or place that makes you more comfortable, or do you love always the constant shift?
I think that you're bringing a very good point, that in the last sort of 2 decades, maybe, I start using the term archetypal for spaces that we feel comfortable in. And I talk to my students often about, what's your archetype? Like, what is the kind of, can you describe the type of space where it makes you feel comfortable at the very bodily level, right? At the level where I can touch and feel, where I can situate myself. I go back to my childhood when I was born and raised in Hong Kong. We moved into a house when I was 7 years old. My dad hired a Canadian architect, and then, he was working for the British government in housing. So they were able to get like lease, what we call crown land, which is like a double lease of Chinese land. And we built a house that is very Bauhaus style, up against a hill looking at the sea. Right. And that's always the condition of my comfort, which is you got a mountain behind you and you're looking at the ocean. I think that's why I keep returning back to LA. There is that kind of primal condition in a larger scale, right? I'm not in a house, but then in the situation of the city, I'm still having that. I feel very comfortable about that. And in a very weird, small way, New York does that too, because you can be back up against a concrete building and you're looking out at the Hudson or whatever, and I need to be near an edge of land. That's what I think, that's the archetypal condition. And I need someone behind my back, Just like a dog, right?
Yeah, that comfort. Okay, so the nature of culture is also something that's very, very pervasive in your work and in your thinking, and how important, or what's that connection between I don't know how to say this most appropriately. I was going to say culture and the building. Like we see cultural types of structures that belong to culture, and then we see places like I would say more like New York or like London, where there are a wider variety of places that are still part of culture because of the people within using the spaces. But have you thought about that link between the culture of the place and the buildings? Yeah.
I mean, you're opening up maybe a doctoral subject matter. I
Good. We can
remember,
give it to somebody else.
well, me reading like Mike Davis, City of Quartz, which is the
Mhm.
history of Los Angeles, and him talking about scripted spaces on Bunker Hill, where you
Mhm.
just naturally feel like you can't do this or spit on the ground or whatever, right? That there is an an embodied uh, thing that designers do to spaces somehow that scripted all these rules and regulations without having to post a sign, right?
Mhm.
And I think that in cities where the influx of different cultures come in and start appropriating spaces, that's where those script can get a little bit blurry and erased. So when you see farmers market taking over, you know, squares and intersections of streets and stuff like that, it allows people to reimagine a different script for spaces in the urban environment. I think it's very interesting. And even in during our time in this kind of pandemic, where you start having restaurants really push out onto the sidewalk of taking over a parking lane and stuff like that, it suddenly looked like a different city, right? The culture of the street already changed. Long time ago, I was working on an article with a colleague of mine who's now in Liverpool, Dr. Paulette Singley, and we wrote an article called Entrancement. And all we did was talk about where does interior really end in an urban setting? Does it really end at the facade of the building? And with her PhD in architectural history, we start talking about a whole host of resources talking about what the facade really is, like when does the facade really end and where does the street begins. And then we start talking about like, hey, I in Hong Kong when I was young, walking by major department stores down Nathan Road in Kowloon, the when the door opens and that air conditioning comes out into that subtropical heat, right? And you feel the interior pushing out. So even in the kind of atmospheric way, or if you go downtown Los Angeles or something like that, sometimes some of the vendors on Broadway, like the streets, like the merchants would push their stuff out, and you start hearing the boombox going, and you start smelling whatever it is, and cigarettes, and now pot and whatever going on, and you realize that the interior really does not stop. So I think that what we haven't given a lot of thought about was how cultures of spaces, in fact, gets an injection from the interior, right? Whatever the
Yeah.
occupant is, whatever the function is and stuff, it does, in fact, that kind of spaces of that is the shared urban, joint property environment. Um, yeah, I always wondered about squares between the way that, let's say, for example, you go to Finland, you go to London, the squares are different than our squares, the
Mhm.
Italian piazza and stuff like that. And I think a long time ago, I forgot which one. I think there is an organization that really only studies public spaces, and they publish like 10 rules about how to make a good public plaza and stuff. And I think that a lot of that needs to be revisited, and, you know, like maybe culture needs to be sort of looked at in a much more broad way, by the injection of the occupants coming and doing a kind of, impromptu performance or something like that that changes things, or people who are semi-permanent, like the recurring, uh, farmers market, or even like some unplanned thing where the interior really pushed out, out of, I don't know, a flood, or I don't know even what, you know.
Yeah, it's that interesting combination of the human culture and the contextual culture of the
Mm,
place, because the natural culture, I mean, one could argue the pandemic endemic has been this external, contextual culture that has had a huge impact on the way that people behave. But
yeah,
it still will be, it's still the human, kind of interaction with whatever that challenge is.
yeah,
That's kind of, um, motivating, if you will, motivating for making any of those shifts. Because arguably we could go back to the way that we were
Yeah.
if when things, calm down, though there's always the progress and those things. And there's a word, and I have to go back and find the word. There's a word for once you've learned something, you cannot unlearn it. There's actually a word that describes that.
Yeah, I would like to know that. You find
Well,
it
isn't
and
that,
let me know. Yeah.
I will definitely let you know, because I've thought about so many times when people go, well, we can just, I'm like, no, you now
You
know it
can't
is a
unlearn
part
it.
of.
Yeah.
You can unlearn that. Yeah, because it's experiential. It is of. Um, Gosh, I wanted that one of the other questions that I had for you, which kind of goes off in a tiny little bit of a different direction, but not. It's the unmentionable symposium.
Oh, yeah.
And I just loved hearing about that. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about the thinking behind it
Okay.
with the audience.
So in 2017 and 2019, my colleagues, mostly Heather Peterson, who teaches at Woodbury University's School of Architecture and the Interior Architecture Department, as well as at that time our department chair Christoph Corner and another colleague who teaches both architecture and interior, Matthew Gillis. We started and also with a philosophy colleague, started imagining a symposium based on a quote that Dave Hickey, the recently passed art critic, talked about, which is, he said, like, the new ideas are never going to come from things that we talked about all the time, because we've talked about it so much it gets threadbare. The new ideas are going to come from those dusty corners with the dust bunnies where we haven't talked about those things for a long time. And we took it as a kind of clue to kind of inspect what architectural education has been. And we realized that there are certain words that we just cannot say in architecture school. So that would be like, for a while, we can't use the word atmosphere. It's too touchy-feely, right? You can't define it, from the history of architecture or something like that. And there are a whole host of words like that. I think it's still somewhere buried in some video somewhere. We had all spoken those words, and we said, these words are unmentionable in architecture school. So that's where the unmentionable came in. And of course, when you Google unmentionable, all you get is underwear, So, but unmentionables came from that. And then we saw it we just kind of brought that subject out broadly to a national and internationals, mostly academic audience, and just say, submit anything that we haven't talked about for a long time. So we got all kinds of stuff. We got someone sending in things about curtain, someone who would come in and say, there is a fantastic avocado green molded fiberglass bathroom that I've been obsessed about. We have people who are just talking about, sort of like everything from the sensation of the color yellow on the paper, wallpaper and stuff. So the first symposium, we ended up kicking it off with a production designer, a renowned novelist, and a artist who works both in media and in different medium, basically. And we posed the word interior, said, what is interior to you in your work? And that's how we kicked off that unmentionable symposium. And then we collected all these people who have presented papers and presentation. And then in 2019, we said, well, should we look at some other structure? We've casted a pretty broad net the first time. How about if we look at the structure of a symposium? What does a symposium really mean? And my colleague Heather Peterson went back to study it and say, hey, it was, like in Socrates' time or something like that. A symposium happens in, the most sort of noted philosopher's house, in the best room of the house. And there's a lot of drinking, there's a lot of poetry reading, there's philosophizing and all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of imbibing and stuff and goes on. And so we said, okay, let's do the 2019 symposium with that in mind. So we had a whole host of things, from like workshops, from We had Jane Rendell, who's one of the really, noted thinkers right now of interior architecture in England. We have a bunch of colleagues from Pratt and Parsons in New York. They're also kind of in California College of Design who are in interior architecture, so leading thinking and stuff like that, doing workshops. We have music things, we have installations, all kinds of stuff happening in that symposium, but all to kind of say, here are the taboo words, let's go at it, because maybe something new will come out of it. Yeah.
And what do you think did? Anything new? I'm also, and the reason why I ask that question is because I'm often, when you are so caught up in the enthusiasm and the energy of the event or of the activity, and then you walk away and go, what did I take? Did anything continue?
Yeah, I think it did. For those who were there, I think that the idea of marginalization being actually a tool for investigation rather than, a marginalized area of practice or subject is just not worth it. You can see all kinds of, for example, Joe Sanders in New York came and presented the bathroom stall, right? And it's about equality, it's about giving access to different people and not stigmatizing them, to public spaces of the toilet.
Excellent.
Yeah, things like that, right? There is great impact to that. And I wish that we could still continue. And then I think, maybe in time we'll gather enough energy and kind of continue to explore those different areas as well. Yeah.
Well, you brought me back to the end that I wanted, which is pretty fantastic, because I wanted to give you a chance to share your recent rant that you posted. Yeah, well, it's a continuation of this kind of conversation. We were talking about stigmatization or marginalization of, and so your rant starts, I'm just going to read the first sentence and then I'm going to let you.
Okay.
The professionalization of interior design is about safeguarding the health, safety, and welfare of the public and about achieving social justice, period. Where does that go?
I'm happy to report that there's some movement, but I'll talk about that later. It's been a constant struggle for many years. I think maybe interior design has been a university subject, major study degree offering program, less than 100 years, right? Whereas in architecture, been around for a long time. There's been centuries of philosophizing, and canon making and stuff in architecture. Interior designers are not protected by neither the Title Act nor the Practice Act that architects enjoy, which is you cannot call yourself an interior designer unless you have passed a certain test, right? And you cannot practice, interior design unless you have, the proper licensure and stuff like that. But we don't have that in our culture right now, with the HGTV and everybody sort of, saying, yeah, if you have the eye, you can do it. So there's a diminishing sense that it can be professionalized state by state, depending on the legislature and political will and lobbying efforts and stuff like that. Some have granted certain amount of professional licensure to interior design professionals, which are mostly women. And
mostly women in a rather staggering majority, somewhere in the majority, 80% of interior designers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Plus
so
or minus. Yeah.
Without that licensure, that means that it's like you go to your nail people and your hair people, they all have to be licensed. You can't just, and that protects their livelihood, right? And protects the public health, safety, and welfare. We don't have that interior design. And that's like a majority, like I said, 98% of the time you're in an interior, but you're not really kind of protecting us from things that could go wrong. They say, what could go wrong? Like I think, for example, Nevada, the reason why you can't practice interior design in Nevada unless you're licensed is, somebody specs some weird unflammable, like flammable things in the casino, and a disaster happened. And then the state legislature jumped into action and said, we got to do this. But the nemesis of interior designers so far has been the AIA, which I'm a member of.
Right.
And I've been in their interior architecture committee for a very long time. And then, they've been spending a lot of money lobbying against the professionalization of interior designers, giving them a sense of, that they have a licensure test that can kind of prove their professionality. Just in December, the executive board of the AIA have changed their tune. So I'm happy to say that they're relaxing that. They no longer are going to say only architects can do interior, or like nobody else, like no test can kind of prove that you can do interior. So there's light on, in the horizon in terms of professionalization. But I think it's a women issue. Like it's, if the majority of the practitioner are women and you're stopping them from having this kind of practice that's professional, protected by licensure, protected by Title or Practice Act, you're really basically discriminating against a class of people, and suppressing the economic livelihood. So for me, it's more of that issue than anything else. So that's my rant, really.
Well, you did a very good job, and we're gonna. I'll post it on our website when we have the posting of your particular podcast. There's the whole transcript and with links to many of the things that we've talked about. Okay. So we'll definitely have that so people can see it. And I want to say thank you so very much.
Yeah,
it's been a lovely conversation.
Well. Yeah, lovely conversation, and I'm glad you're doing these podcasts and stuff. It's great. Yeah, I'm enjoying it a lot.
So. We really, really enjoy sharing and it's stories that people have to share about what they've been doing within our realm of, place and people, and the greater. It's such an amazing connection. So. The Wonder podcast is available on all podcast streaming sources, so Apple, Spotify, et cetera. And we will look forward to seeing or speaking with all of our audience members again sometime in the near future.